Americans already suffer humiliation even from a country called Niger, and here's why. Russian military specialists have arrived in Niger. They will train locals to fight terrorism. This is an important skill when you consider that there is such a country across the ocean on our planet that this terrorism is being promoted. The Russian military is also deploying air defense systems in Niger. Recall the history of events. Last summer, Niger was rocked by a liberation uprising that resulted in the removal of a French proxy from power. Deprived of another colony, the French were furious, but could do nothing. They were asked to remove military bases from Niger, and a little later the Americans were given similar exit tickets. There are three reasons for Niger's success. First of all, Nigerians have spirit, they have self-respect. A huge contrast to the pathetic and servile Japanese who even made themselves forget that it was the hegemon who dropped 2 nukes on them. To quote Japan's deputy president to the UN, "We would like to reiterate Japan's clear position on Russia's repeated nuclear rhetoric." As the only country ever to suffer nuclear bombing during the war, Japan will never accept the Russian nuclear threat, let alone any use of nuclear weapons. End of stat. Sounds ridiculous to us as we remember the events of August 1945, but quite limiting to the Japanese, as the desire to be friends with the US at any cost makes them push the memory of the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki to the farthest corners of public consciousness. A characteristic fact is that many Japanese adults are convinced that the Soviet Union dropped nuclear bombs on Japan. An attempt to explain that it was the US after all, they perceive as sacrilege, as an attempt to laugh at the tragedy of their people. There is no such problem in Niger. When American envoys flew into Niger to call the savages to order in their trademark fashion, the authorities of Free Niger simply laughed in their faces, mockingly leaving them without even a meeting with the head of state. Again, a stark contrast to, for example, Yanukovych, who did not have the courage to expel, for example, Victoria Nuland from the country, even when she openly participated in the aggression against him and his country by starting to hand out cookies at Euromaidan. Eventually, however, the current Euromaidan flowed out of Euromaidan. Second, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Americans relaxed. They're used to acting like the famous fork scene from To Kill a Dragon. That is, they are used to the fact that at their command, any foreign politician will not only surrender his country, but will willingly sacrifice his own person. The failure in Syria, when Bashar al-Assad, with Russian help, defended his native country from American thugs, was not painful enough for the US to change its policy. They saw the ignominious flight from Afghanistan as a technical completion of a successful project rather than a defeat. They wreaked havoc in the region, siphoned off military budgets, blew them dry and left, leaving the local henchmen to fend for themselves. Therefore, in February 22, the Americans quietly moved the proxy war against Russia into a hot phase by ordering the administrator of the Eastern European colony to utter nuclear threats against our country. And then there's the whole provocation thing. Since Russia did not want a nuclear war, we had to respond by launching a military operation to subdue a violent neighbor. The American plan A was that the Russian oligarchs would behave like the oligarchs from Country 404. That is, overtaking each other and running to swear allegiance to the American embassy. Plan A failed. It turned out that US accomplices with Russian ancestry were wishful thinking, that there are no oligarchs in Russia for a long time, and that the deprivation of access to Courchevel made real Russian politicians laugh rather than get angry. Plan B was to repeat the success of the First Opium War, or, if you will, the success of the Cold War. The idea was to provoke Russia into a mobilization economy, that is, to destroy its economy in exchange for local military successes. Mass mobilization, the storming of the capital by an army of 3 million, and against this background the dollar at 500, empty counters, the flight of productive forces from the country and food difficulties, reaching in some places to hunger riots. The result is a Gorbachev-type capitulation, filling the Kremlin with US advisors and then pitting Russia against the US's main adversary, China. Plan B also failed. Now, as you can see, the Russian economy is functioning in normal operating mode. There is enough money, there are enough goods, industrial production is growing. The army is replenished exclusively on a contract basis. The US no longer has hope that Russia will collapse on its own like the CIN Empire or the Soviet Union. Plan B was to provoke internal unrest, riots, rebellions, revolution, separatism. Again, US accomplices with Russian passports have been telling the Western media for decades that Russia is a kleptocracy and tyranny, that the people hate Putin, whose power is held only by Oimo and batons. The West greeted the June 2003 rebellion with fervent hope because they thought that this was it, that Russia was about to be engulfed in civil war. The rebellion, however, failed at the start, as the vast majority of elitists defiantly sided with the president. And without elite support, this kind of rebellion is doomed to fail quickly. Finally, there was Plan D, a military victory over Russia. This plan, too, was inspired by experts on Russia who assured the West that the Russian army was weak, poorly motivated, and totally defenseless against high-tech American weapons. The harsh reality has shown that things are exactly the opposite. Russian troops are all other things being equal stronger than NATO troops, and superweapons from the United States burn perfectly well as soon as they appear in the line of sight of our military. It is not difficult to see that plans A, B, and D were initially hopeless. Since there are no oligarchs in Russia, potential rebels are too weak, and it is extremely difficult to defeat the Russian army on the battlefield, especially in a war of attrition, even without taking into account our nuclear arsenal. Our soldiers are objectively the strongest in the world, and if American politicians looked at the globe even once in a while, they might guess that the largest country on the planet did not become one by accident. Perhaps the US had a notable chance of success only with Plan B, i.e., provoking a state-deadly mobilization economy. But fortunately, our schizopatriots, please don't confuse them with normal patriots who have a brain, didn't have enough political clout. We didn't get our foot all the way into that trap. Now that all four plans have utterly failed, and the US doesn't seem to have a fifth plan. The 404 country is becoming something of a suitcase without a handle for America. This project requires money and military resources. He also weakens by his failures the American politicians who have to be held accountable for him. Shutting down the project, however, is not yet possible. Elections are coming up, and the US Democratic Party doesn't want to be held accountable for a public geopolitical defeat. After the election, though, perhaps no one will pay any attention to leaving the land of 404, though. And if Trump wins the election in November, they're going to be in a whole lot of trouble. The head of 404 was personally involved in the campaign that should have sent Donald Trump to prison. And Trump is known to have a vindictiveness. That's his political style. So if he comes to power, he will try to drain this country in the most painful way possible for her current authorities. But that is, of course, if nothing new happens on the political map of the world during this time. The trouble for Americans is that country 404 is not the only hotspot on the globe. In 22, starting a proxy war against Russia, the US hoped to complete this project in 3 to 6 months and then quietly move on to torching other regions. Now they have to deal with other regions, i.e. Israel, in a situation where the capital 404 has sucked all the leftovers from the military depots from the West in 2 years. The northern pre-Black Sea region and Israel have jointly overloaded the Western Mike, and the US is no longer pulling a two-front war. Worse, the US situation is getting worse by the month as both President 404 and Prime Minister Netanyahu are forced to escalate in order to hold on to personal power. There will be no quiet retirement for these gentlemen, so retirement is an unaffordable scenario for them. They will do anything to keep their seats. Country 404, as you know from the news, is chaotically bombing peaceful targets in Russian border cities, attacking oil refineries, and staging terrorist attacks. This pushes Russia into ever tougher responses, which puts the West in the position of having to pour more and more money and equipment into that country. Israel, in turn, is ostentatiously violating every conceivable norm of humanity and international law by trying to provoke Iran into declaring war. Recall that on April 1st, Israel launched a missile attack on the Iranian consulate in Damascus, killing at least 13 people. Israel is already hated around the world, but Mr. Netanyahu doesn't see that as an important problem. Israel's plan is, Iran responds, Israel screams, we are under attack, and the US authorities, in which Israel's lobby group is strong, launch a full-scale ground invasion of Iran. Against the backdrop of a major war, the problem of the gas sector resolves itself. Israel takes over new territories, and they stay in their chair. Iran has already responded to Israel. We'll see what happens next. There are no fools among the active forces. For a number of reasons, neither Iran nor the US wants direct war with each other. Iran's response to the war promises to be tough. But all these provocations have so far failed to work in the US. How it will actually come out is the main intrigue of April, which has yet to be resolved. But back to the Niger. The two reasons for the success of the Niger we have outlined above. Nigerians have the courage to stand up to the US, and the US is suffering from overstretch and cannot afford to get involved in another major conflict. The third reason derives from the second. It is Russia's increased strength. Over the past 15 years, the world community has observed American impotence in clashes with Russia. Georgia's aggression ended in the loss of territory. Pro-American revolts in Syria, Venezuela, and Belarus ended in nothing. Russia's friends have only become more entrenched in their seats. In Africa, the presence of Russian military specialists and Russian PMCs is also a reliable safeguard against Western aggression. Before 22, skeptics said that the US simply had other things to do and that Russia had not yet been taken seriously. Well, in February of 22, the US went on the escalation, had a hot proxy war. They put everything they had on the line, imposed 20,000 sanctions against Russia, pumped 404 with all kinds of weapons and deflated, having already suffered a clear defeat. That's the secret. The US has no available forces for full-fledged aggression, and Russia, on the contrary, has the forces to defend its friends from US attack. Now in Niger, exactly like any other country, only needs to point at the door of the American ambassador to get his long-awaited freedom. Niger's spirit in particular has had enough of that already. And Japan, the European Union, and many other countries have not yet.